The morning begins in silence that feels almost harmless, the kind of silence people mistake for safety. But history rarely announces tragedy in advance. It hides within routine, ordinary light, and days that feel the same. In Colorado City, Hailey Dunn entered that rhythm and never returned. There are moments in every investigation where everything depends on a single question. How does a person disappear without leaving behind a clear trace? No warning that anyone can agree on, no definitive witness, no immediate sign of struggle, just absence. And absence in its purest form is far more disturbing than violence because it offers no boundaries for explanation. Colorado City feels familiar, where everyone believes they know their community. It is small enough for connection, yet large enough for privacy. Neighbors notice routines more than truth. Daily commutes, school buses, quiet exchanges shape the surface. Beneath that calm rhythm lies not true safety, but simple, fragile predictability. Before we go deeper into this case, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not for promotion, but because cases like this survive in public memory only when people continue to look at what others try to forget. December 27, 2010, began like any other winter morning in West Texas. Cold air settled over rooftops, and families moved through their routines with mechanical comfort. Nothing in the early hours suggested that the structure of one household would soon fracture into uncertainty. This is how most disappearances begin, not with disruption, but with continuation. Inside that ordinary morning was Hailey Dunn, a 13-year-old girl navigating the emotional complexity of adolescence in a household that was not simple. At her age, identity is still forming through reflection, reaction, and adaptation. She was described as energetic, social, and expressive in familiar settings. But like many teenagers, she also carried moments of withdrawal that adults often overlook. Her life was shaped by overlapping relationships that required constant emotional adjustment. She lived with her mother, Billy Dunn, who carried the responsibility of maintaining structure while managing personal and financial strain. Her biological father, Clint Dunn, remained emotionally present but physically distant, watching from the edges of her daily life. Between them stood Sean Adkins, her mother's boyfriend, who had become a consistent presence inside the home environment. From a psychological perspective, such a household creates layered emotional dynamics. Authority is not always clearly defined. Boundaries can shift depending on stress, communication, and unresolved tension. For a child or teenager, this environment does not necessarily feel dangerous in an obvious way, but it can feel unstable in ways that are harder to articulate. Those who observed Hailey from outside the family sometimes describe subtle changes in her behavior over time. Nothing extreme, nothing immediately alarming, but enough to suggest internal processing. Adolescents often internalize conflict rather than express it directly, especially when they feel responsible for maintaining peace in their environment. That internalization can become invisible until it suddenly is not. The people closest to her held different emotional roles. Her mother represented structure, authority, and the weight of daily stress and exhaustion. Her father represented distance mixed with concern, limited by circumstance. Her mother's boyfriend represented constant proximity and daily presence within the home. These roles shaped more than relationships, because psychological proximity often defines access during vulnerable moments. Colorado City itself reinforced a sense of security that may not have reflected underlying reality. Small towns often develop collective assumptions about safety, built on repetition rather than analysis. Crime feels distant until it is not, and when something unexpected happens, the shock is amplified by the belief that it should not have happened there at all. Inside homes across the town, life continued with quiet normality. Doors closed, televisions played softly, and conversations unfolded without urgency. Yet behind some of those doors were emotional tensions that did not appear in public view. Family systems can maintain external stability while internally accumulating strain. This is one of the most important realities in understanding missing persons cases. Hailey's environment was not defined by a single dramatic conflict, but by the accumulation of smaller emotional pressures. These are the kinds of conditions that rarely appear significant in isolation. A tense conversation here, a withdrawn moment there, a shift in tone that no one fully interprets at the time. Investigators later attempt to reconstruct these fragments, not as proof of anything specific, but as context for understanding what might have been building beneath the surface. In cases involving sudden disappearance, investigators often return to the final normal day with particular focus. Normality becomes a clue in itself. When a life changes abruptly, the final hours before that change carry disproportionate investigative weight. Every detail is re-examined, not because it was necessarily important at the time, but because it is now all that remains. For Hailey Dunn, that final stretch of normality would later become the central focus of a case that expanded far beyond a local concern. What began as a missing teenager report would evolve into a complex investigation involving multiple agencies, shifting theories, and years of unanswered questions. At first, nothing suggested the scale of what was coming. There was no immediate evidence of abduction, no witness describing violence, and no clear event explaining disappearance. Only a silent transition from presence to absence. Cases like this carry psychological weight because the human mind instinctively searches for meaning, reconstructing possibilities, and attaching significance to silence when certainty no longer exists. By the time concern replaced ordinary expectation, the change had already happened. Hailey Dunn was no longer simply a teenager moving through another day. She had become the center of an unexplained absence that could not be ignored. And within that quiet shift, one devastating truth slowly emerged. And then, in a completely ordinary moment, Hailey Dunn vanished. The morning of December 27, 2010, does not begin with chaos or warning signs that would later define the case. It begins with routine, the kind of structured normality that rarely draws attention. In missing persons investigations, it is often this exact normality that later becomes the most disturbing element, because it hides the moment everything silently changes. On that morning, Hailey Dunn was believed to be at home, moving through familiar patterns that seemed ordinary at the time. Nothing about the early timeline immediately suggested danger or disruption. In fact, the recorded activity and communication that existed during those hours initially appeared consistent with a typical day in a teenager's life. Yet investigators often return to these final hours with a different mindset. They look for irregularities that were invisible in real time, a message sent slightly out of character, a delay that does not align with habit, a small behavioral shift that only gains meaning after the outcome is known. These are not obvious clues, but fragments of context. The concept of last known moments is psychologically powerful because it represents the boundary between presence and absence. Everything before it is life as usual. Everything after it becomes uncertainty. In Hailey's case, that boundary was not clearly defined, which would later complicate every attempt to reconstruct what truly happened. There was no confirmed indication of distress during those early hours, no widely verified signal of panic or urgency. Instead, what existed was fragmentation, partial data, inconsistent recollections, and timelines that did not align perfectly when placed side by side. In investigations like this, inconsistency is not proof, but it is direction. As the day progressed, something shifted from normal expectation to concern, though not immediately in a dramatic way. It often begins like that in missing persons cases involving young individuals. A missed check-in, a lack of response, or a failure to return at an expected time. At first, these gaps are interpreted through optimism rather than fear, but optimism has a limit. When time passes without resolution, interpretation changes. The absence of communication begins to feel less like coincidence and more like disruption. This is the psychological threshold where families transition from waiting to worrying and from worrying to searching. In the Dunn household, that transition eventually occurred. When Hailey did not return as expected, concern replaced routine. Search efforts began informally at first, driven by family instinct rather than procedural urgency. This phase is often emotionally charged because hope and fear exist simultaneously without clear direction. When those early efforts failed to locate her, the situation escalated. A call to law enforcement was made under conditions of distress and uncertainty. At this stage, many cases still begin with the possibility of voluntary absence. Teenagers are sometimes classified as runaways until evidence suggests otherwise, but that classification rarely remains stable for long. As more details were reviewed, the initial assumptions began to weaken. There were inconsistencies in timing, gaps in clarity, and emotional reactions that investigators noted as part of the broader behavioral context. None of these elements alone confirmed anything, but together, they formed a pattern that required deeper attention. The house where Hailey had last been seen became the center of focus, not because it immediately revealed answers, but because it represented the last confirmed environment of her presence. In forensic reasoning, the final known location is never just a place. It is a timeline anchor. Inside that space, there were no clear signs of forced entry reported at the earliest stage of investigation. No immediate indication of struggle that could be definitively verified. Instead, what remained was stillness. Objects in place, routine interrupted, and an absence that felt disproportionate to the normality that preceded it. The idea of a critical moment in such cases is often misleading. It suggests a single, identifiable instant where everything changed. In reality, it is usually a gradual disappearance of clarity, a narrowing window of certainty until nothing remains but interpretation. In Hailey's case, that window was already closing. As investigators expanded their review, attention shifted towards statements from people closest to Hailey. These accounts changed subtly over time. Minor inconsistencies appeared in details involving timing, movement, and presence. Alone, such differences might seem harmless. Together, however, they began attracting scrutiny. Investigators understand that memory under pressure is fragile, often reshaped by stress, fear, and repetition. Behavioral analysis in missing persons investigations does not automatically treat inconsistency as proof of deception. Instead, it examines stress responses, emotional instability, and the gradual distortion of memory over time. Yet when conflicting details repeatedly intersect with critical moments, they become impossible to ignore. Patterns begin emerging, not as direct evidence, but as structures investigators feel compelled to examine. During the early search phase, emotional reactions from those closest to Hailey were carefully observed and documented. Some responses appeared immediate, emotional, and visibly distressed. Others seemed unusually controlled, almost detached from the urgency surrounding the disappearance. Investigators know that trauma affects people differently, but extreme emotional contrasts often become psychologically significant when reconstructing events surrounding unresolved cases like this one. The shift from a missing persons case to suspected foul play rarely occurs instantly. It develops slowly as uncertainty accumulates and timelines stop aligning cleanly with expected behavior. In Hailey's case, that transition began when reported movements, personal accounts, and available evidence no longer fit together naturally. Each inconsistency deepened concern, gradually transforming uncertainty into something far more unsettling for investigators. One of the most significant developments emerged from digital traces connected to Hailey's communication devices. Reports suggested her phone may have remained active after the point she was believed missing. In modern investigations, digital activity can redefine timelines completely. However, even technology carries uncertainty. Signals overlap, timestamps conflict, and interpretations vary, often creating new questions instead of delivering definitive answers for authorities. As analysts reconstructed the sequence of events, a critical problem remained unresolved. No single moment of disappearance could be confirmed with certainty. Competing interpretations surrounded the final point Hailey was believed safe. Without certainty, every theory weakened, and with time, the growing silence became more terrifying than any explanation possible. When law enforcement formally expanded the investigation into Hailey Dunn's disappearance, the case shifted from a local concern into a structured search for answers that no longer fit within simple explanations. The initial response focused on the immediate environment surrounding the home, nearby streets, and any location where movement could have occurred during the critical window of time. In missing child cases, the first hours are always the most important, yet they are also the most vulnerable to irreversible loss of evidence. As officers combed through the area, they attempted to reconstruct a physical timeline based on last confirmed sightings and environmental indicators. However, early investigative phases are often shaped by urgency rather than completeness. Small oversights, missed observations, and incomplete documentation can later become permanent gaps in the case file. In Hailey's situation, some of these early limitations would become points of concern as the investigation progressed. What complicates any disappearance investigation is the tension between assumption and confirmation. At first, there is a natural tendency to treat the situation as a runaway case, especially when dealing with adolescents. This classification influences the direction of early searches, sometimes narrowing focus too slowly when time is already critical. As inconsistencies accumulated in Hailey's case, that initial assumption began to weaken. As days turned into weeks, media attention began to intensify. Local news coverage quickly expanded into national reporting, transforming a small-town disappearance into a widely discussed mystery. Once a case enters the public narrative, it no longer belongs solely to investigators. It becomes a shared psychological space where speculation and interpretation compete with verified information. The rise of social media added a new layer of complexity. Online discussions, forums, and commentary threads began generating theories that range from plausible to highly speculative. Some focused on family dynamics, others on external abduction scenarios, and many attempted to reconstruct timelines based on limited public information. While public interest can sometimes generate useful leads, it can also distort perception and amplify uncertainty. For Hailey's family, the public attention created an additional layer of psychological pressure. Instead of experiencing grief and uncertainty in private, they were placed under continuous scrutiny. Every statement, reaction, or inconsistency was analyzed by strangers attempting to construct meaning from fragments. This level of exposure often complicates emotional processing in missing persons cases. As investigative focus deepened, attention increasingly turned toward individuals closest to Hailey. Among them, Sean Adkins became a central figure of interest due to his proximity to the household and his presence during the time frame surrounding her disappearance. In investigations, proximity does not imply guilt, but it does establish relevance when reconstructing last known interactions. The complexity of family dynamics introduced additional challenges. Relationships within the household were not static. They contained tension, dependency, and emotional overlap that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on perspective. Investigators had to carefully separate emotional narratives from factual evidence, a process that is often more difficult than it appears. Despite growing suspicion and public focus, no direct evidence emerged that conclusively linked any individual to the disappearance. This absence of physical proof created a persistent investigative limitation. Without definitive forensic confirmation, theories remained within the realm of probability rather than certainty. As time passed, previously overlooked aspects of the family environment began to surface. Statements made at different times revealed subtle inconsistencies in recollection. In emotionally charged cases, memory itself becomes unstable, influenced by stress, repetition, and external questioning. Investigators must therefore distinguish between intentional deception and cognitive distortion, a distinction that is rarely straightforward. Some details related to interpersonal conflict and household dynamics became points of discussion in later investigative reviews. However, these elements remained context rather than conclusion. They provided texture to the environment surrounding Hailey's life, but they did not resolve the central question of what happened during the critical window of disappearance. One of the enduring difficulties in this case is the presence of multiple overlapping narratives. Each account contributes a fragment of understanding, yet none fully align into a single coherent sequence. This fragmentation is not unusual in complex missing persons cases, especially when time has eroded the reliability of immediate recollection. Years after the initial investigation, the case underwent renewed evaluation as advancements in forensic methodology and data analysis became available. Cold case reviews often revisit earlier assumptions with new tools, not because the facts have changed, but because interpretation frameworks have evolved. In Hailey's case, this meant re-examining existing evidence through updated analytical perspectives. Despite these renewed efforts, the central question remained unresolved. The timeline still contained gaps that could not be conclusively bridged. Digital traces, witness statements, and physical evidence all contributed partial clarity, but none provided final resolution. The absence of closure became the defining characteristic of the case. What emerges from long-term analysis is not a single theory, but a layered structure of uncertainty. Each layer represents an attempt to impose order on incomplete information, yet beneath all interpretations, the fundamental absence remains unchanged. Hailey Dunn was present, and then she was not, and the transition between those states remains undefined. As investigators continue revisiting the case, one reality grows heavier with time. Unanswered questions never disappear, they simply evolve. Despite years of analysis, reconstruction, and scrutiny, the central mystery remains unresolved. Where is Hailey Dunn? And as that question echoes through reports and memory, the investigation reveals a chilling truth. The deeper the search goes, the quieter the darkness becomes. When a case remains unsolved for years, it slowly transforms from an active investigation into a structure of competing interpretations. Facts remain fixed, but meaning becomes fluid. In the disappearance of Hailey Dunn, the absence of resolution has produced multiple theories, each attempting to explain the same silence in different ways. None of them fully close the gap, but each reflects a different way the human mind tries to understand uncertainty. One of the most commonly discussed frameworks is what investigators and observers often refer to as internal conflict theory. This perspective focuses on the idea that the origin of disappearance may lie within the immediate environment of the victim. It does not require external intrusion. Instead, it examines emotional proximity, interpersonal tension, and unresolved dynamics within the household or close relationships. In cases like this, proximity becomes a psychological variable as much as a physical one. Internal conflict theory does not claim certainty. It instead examines patterns of behavior, inconsistencies in timelines, and emotional structures that may suggest escalation. Families under stress often contain invisible lines of tension that are not always visible to outsiders. When a critical event occurs, those lines are re-examined in hindsight, sometimes taking on significance that was not recognized at the time. The second major framework is the theory of opportunistic intrusion. This hypothesis suggests that the disappearance may have been the result of an external individual who acted during a moment of vulnerability or lack of attention. Unlike internal theories, this perspective does not depend on prior relationship dynamics. Instead, it focuses on timing, opportunity, and environmental exposure. Opportunistic scenarios are particularly difficult to investigate because they often leave minimal trace. There may be no prior connection, no established pattern, and no obvious reason for targeting a specific individual beyond circumstance. In such cases, randomness itself becomes the most disturbing element because it removes predictability from the equation of harm. The tension between these two theories creates a fundamental investigative divide. One suggests familiarity, the other suggests randomness. One implies embedded dynamics, the other implies external unpredictability. And the question that remains at the center of the case is not simply what happened, but what kind of explanation the human mind is willing to accept. Psychological analysis of disappearance cases often returns to a central concept: trust as vulnerability. In many incidents involving missing individuals, especially minors, the mechanism of harm is not force alone, but access. Access is often granted through familiarity, routine, or perceived safety. This does not require conscious decision-making from the victim, but rather the absence of perceived threat. In controlled environments, trust is built gradually and often unconsciously. It is shaped by repetition, presence, and emotional conditioning. When trust is present, defensive awareness is reduced. This is one of the most important psychological realities in understanding how disappearances can occur without immediate resistance or clear evidence of struggle. Another critical psychological element is the role of silence. In investigative terms, silence does not mean absence of activity. It often means absence of observable evidence. In behavioral analysis, situations that lack clear physical traces can sometimes indicate controlled environments where disruption was minimized or where events occurred in a manner that left limited external indicators. However, it is important to distinguish between interpretation and conclusion. Silence is not proof. It is a condition that allows multiple interpretations to coexist without resolution. In Hailey Dunn's case, silence became the defining characteristic of the investigation itself. When considering the final moments in cases like this, psychological research often emphasizes the speed at which events can unfold. In high stress or unexpected situations, the human brain prioritizes immediate assessment over complex reasoning. This can result in delayed recognition of danger, fragmented memory formation, or incomplete recall of events. From a behavioral standpoint, the final moments of awareness are often not fully preserved in a structured narrative. Instead, they exist as fragments of perception. This makes reconstruction extremely difficult, especially when external evidence is limited or absent. Beyond psychological frameworks, there are also philosophical interpretations that attempt to give meaning to unresolved cases. From an Eastern philosophical perspective, there is the concept of causality and consequence, often expressed through the idea that actions leave traces within a broader moral or existential system. Even when human systems fail to produce immediate justice, the sequence of cause and effect continues beyond visible observation. From a Western philosophical perspective, cases like this reveal the complexity and moral ambiguity within human nature. They reflect unpredictable behavior and psychological depth that evidence alone cannot fully explain. In this view, darkness is not some distant external force. It exists as a hidden potential within ordinary people, emerging quietly through choices, silence, and unresolved emotional fractures over time. Both perspectives share one belief: truth may remain hidden, but it is never entirely absent. Justice delayed does not vanish, it simply moves beyond immediate understanding. In Hailey Dunn's case, the lasting tragedy is not only her disappearance, but the persistence of unanswered questions. Her identity survives through continued inquiry, becoming part of a larger pattern of unresolved absence and enduring uncertainty. Over time, cases like this shift in meaning. They are no longer only investigations into events, but reflections on how uncertainty is processed by communities, families, and systems of authority. The absence becomes a structure around which memory and analysis continue to orbit. Hailey Dunn's name now exists in that space between fact and unanswered question. It is a reminder that not all cases resolve within the limits of available time or evidence. Some remain open not because they are forgotten, but because they resist closure. And in that unresolved space, one final truth becomes unavoidable. Silence is not empty. It carries weight. It holds memory. And sometimes it echoes louder than explanation ever could. Some crimes leave no screams, it's only questions. And some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.